While there remains no evidence of community outbreak in New Zealand to date, there continues to be significant outbreaks in other countries, and that poses New Zealand to date relate to people travelling here and bringing the virus with them. While the majority have been returning New Zealanders, that has not always been the case. Therefore, we need to continue to make further decisions and further restrictions to limit the risk of people bringing the virus into New Zealand. From 11:59 p.m. tonight, we will close our border to any non-residents attempting to travel here. This will stop tourists or temporary visa holders, including students or temporary workers, from coming to and entering into New Zealand. New Zealand citizens and permanent residents will be able to return, and of course that includes the children and partners of citizens and permanent residents. These changes will also apply to the Pacific. They had previously been exempted. With the first case of COVID-19 in the Pacific now recorded, it's clear we need to take even stronger measures to protect our Pacific family too. A small number of exemptions will remain for the Pacific, particularly around those who may need to travel here for humanitarian reasons. There will also be exemptions for key workers in the health sector. Protecting New Zealanders from COVID-19 is our #1 priority. To do that, we need to slow it down. Self-isolation is key to our success. All of the evidence to date is that returning New Zealanders understand the requirement for self-isolation, and the spot checks have demonstrated that. But I've been increasingly concerned that visitors to New Zealand have not necessarily adequately self-isolated for 14 days or are choosing not to, and that is an unacceptable risk that we must end. With each day, there are new developments in the global situation. New Zealand has sought to stay ahead of the curve and make decisions prior to other countries, and we do so again. The government understands that this decision will have further impacts on our economy. But by focusing on people's health, we also help our economy. A country in lockdown, devastated by COVID-19, hurts our people, and it also hurts our jobs. But we can continue to support businesses to weather the storm created by the virus. That is why we have put in place New Zealand's most significant peacetime economic response package and will support Kiwi jobs and the domestic economy from COVID-19. I want to acknowledge that in no time in New Zealand's history has a power like this been used, and I recognise how extraordinary it is. But we have to make decisions in the best interest of the health of those who live here, whether they be young or old, whether they are newly arrived or permanent. If we slow down COVID-19, if we break it into small waves of cases rather than the overwhelming number experienced in other countries, that is how we help our jobs and economy too. One final point I wish to make. This applies to people, not products. Those who continue to staff flights that are transporting freight or who continue to navigate the sea freight that comes into New Zealand will still be able to travel here. This will be stocked. There is no reason to panic buy. Have a plan and prepare, but do so knowing that our supermarkets will continue to have food on their shelves if you give them the time to restock them. I am now happy to take questions.
How long will this last for?
We'll continue to review these border restrictions along the same timetable that we set when we announced them on Saturday, and that was on a 16-day rotation.
Was this Was this decision made in consultation with the Australian government? Because Scott Morrison has announced the same restrictions in just the past 30 minutes.
I notified PM Morrison as soon as soon after exiting the Cabinet meeting. We made the decision between 4 and 5 o'clock today, and I notified him as we exited Cabinet.
Were you aware of his decision?
No, I was not.
What about tourists who are already in the country? What will this mean for them?
Essentially, those who have travelled here, I continue to reinforce with them they must self-isolate. And of course, we continue to have those spot checks. We continue to check that they are following our expectations. For those who have been here for longer than that, I would just advise them to check on their ability to leave New Zealand. As you can imagine, flights are starting to reduce. The ability to travel in and out of New Zealand is reducing, so I encourage them to check that they have their chance and ability to leave New Zealand as they plan to.
You've made strong comments about people coming into the country and not obeying those self-isolation rules. How much of this is about what's happening globally and how much is about the fact that people have just not been doing what has been asked of them?
We have continually stayed ahead of the evidence of what we're seeing abroad. I can think of no country who has had 28 cases as New Zealand has now and has made such an extraordinary move to close its borders. Our success so far has been in moving ahead of where we may anticipate being, acting early, acting decisively, and we continue to do so. So that has been a primary consideration. But I too have seen concerning reports of people flouting our expectations. As I said from the beginning, we are a country that likes to welcome visitors, that likes to welcome tourists, but we expect them to follow the rules that we've set. We did deport, we have had deportation notices, but I'm not willing to take risks here, and that is why we're taking a further measure.
You said you chatted to PM Morrison before you made this announcement. Which other world leaders were notified before you told us tonight?
Only PM Morrison. As I said, this decision was made between 4 and 5 o'clock this evening. And then I've come down and informed the New Zealand public. I've notified PM Morrison, and I leave the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade will be notifying others.
Why just Morrison? Why not the likes of Donald Trump or Boris Johnson or other?
PM Morrison, as you'd expect, of course, we have arrangements that affect both our citizens more closely because of our ability to move. And so he is one that I always stay in very close contact with.
There's a few planes that are already in the air which aren't due to land till early tomorrow morning. What happens to the passengers on those?
This applies to those who are boarding by that time this evening. So if you have already boarded and you're already en route, then you will still be able to land. You will be greeted by officials at the border. I've had a minister on the ground at the border this morning. I'd heard reports I was not satisfied with around the way the border was operating. We have beefed up that operation considerably. Everyone continues to receive a requirement to give us complete information about where they will be self-isolating. They will be checked in on by Healthline, and some may get a visit for a spot check, as some already have by the New Zealand Police.
What was it that you weren't satisfied about from the report back from the Minister? Was it that people weren't being notified properly?
I wanted more intensive questioning at the border. I wanted conversations to be happening so that people fully understood their expectations. Now, of course, that will be happening only with returning New Zealand citizens and residents, because I have simply removed the risk. I'm not willing to tolerate risk at our border. That is where predominantly our cases are coming from. Whilst we will continue to have cases in New Zealand as we continue to test New Zealanders with symptoms who have come home, we must slow down the transmission in New Zealand.
Why didn't you do this on Saturday?
You'll remember on Saturday we were, other than Israel, the only country in the world to have made that move. And we continue to make moves with a much smaller number of cases than any other country. Countries around the world right now who are putting in place border restrictions have massive outbreaks. We are making these moves with 28 cases. We continue to move ahead of what is happening with our borders, acting early, acting decisively.
Now,
Because
are
of
you
this tight
confident you
deadline-
have the balance right between acting early and not taking measures that are going to affect the economy disproportionately?
And this is continually the issue that we need to balance. But the decision Cabinet has made is that a country devastated by COVID-19 is an economy devastated by COVID-19. If we manage to slow down the transmission of this virus in New Zealand, that is how we best protect jobs and the economy.
Because of this tight deadline tonight, are you going to, is it inevitable basically that there will need to be mercy flights in order to get people home who are still overseas, who will not be on planes in time?
Keeping in mind there will continue, of course, to be returning New Zealanders. There are some who may be midway through their travels and recognise that flights around the world are diminishing, and so they're seeking to return home. So the likes of Air New Zealand continue to bring New Zealand citizens back, and so some of those flights will be available. I believe Qantas and Jetstar have given an indication that theirs will end near the end of March. So there are flights, but they are diminishing.
But because of those flights no longer having other people, just New Zealanders, it's going to get...
I will just say, keeping in mind that we continue to give assurances to New Zealand that flights will continue to bring freight. So there will be a need for flights to continue to bring freight cargo into New Zealand using what is usually passenger planes. So I anticipate the ability for New Zealanders will be irregular, and it will get more difficult, but that there will be flights.
There are more than 600,000 New Zealanders living in Australia. What's your message to their family members here in New Zealand who won't be able to see their relatives for an indefinite period?
Both countries have already said that those permanent residents and citizens should not travel. And so we've said that to New Zealanders. It's being said to those in Australia. At the moment whilst we do not have community transmission there is in Australia, it is in everyone's best interest if they stay put.
Was there advice from officials that said this is the right move?
I've felt supported by officials in the decisions that we've been making. We have had to move fast though, so we've also been expecting our officials to move quickly with us, but we have an excellent public service in New Zealand.
What advice have you been given on how much this can slow down cases in New Zealand?
That is because we really are one of the only countries in the world to make moves like this with such a small number, it is very difficult to model. But essentially there are two groups of countries currently experiencing COVID-19. There's the likes of Europe who are experiencing what I would describe as a tidal wave. Because of the number of cases, it's very difficult for them to, for instance, contact trace every case, and in some countries they're no longer even testing symptomatic patients. Then there's another group, the likes of Hong Kong, the likes of Singapore, the likes of Taiwan, who when they get cases put in place measures that allow them to then reduce transmission. That is the model that New Zealand is following. We wish to be a case that breaks down and slows down the number of cases we have so we can treat everyone who needs to be treated.
You said there will still be planes. Are you keen as a government to make sure that there's, say, one weekly flight from Sydney to Auckland every week forever, just so make sure people can...
Look, we haven't put in place any particular measures that guarantee that transport, but what we have said will guarantee is the movement of freight. And so that is something that I want to give that assurance again to New Zealanders, that we will continue to have products in New Zealand. The shelves that you might be seeing that aren't stocked, that's simply because people aren't able to replenish them quickly enough. We have been given the assurances for our major suppliers in New Zealand, Progressive and others, that they do have stocks to replenish, so there is no need to panic buy.
You've said that this is going to have an...
Were today's plans, were they discussed with the opposition at all?
No, not at this stage, but I believe that they will be supportive of them. We do try and keep regular briefings with the opposition, but we are continuing to have to make decisions to get ahead of situations in a timely manner that doesn't always allow us to do that before we discuss it with Cabinet.
Do you think we're nearing a time when there should be a formal cross-party approach to it?
I have asked the Minister and we have been seeking to work in that way. There's now regular briefings on economic issues weekly. I believe the Minister of Finance has established. I've asked the Minister of Health to establish a weekly briefing for all parliamentarians, and also to start weekly notices of written communication too. As I've said many times, this is a global issue that impacts all New Zealanders, and we should be able to remove the politics from that.
You said that this is going to have a significant economic impact, and more so than the decision to shut down or have the 14-day isolation period. Will the government need to...
It's more significant in terms of the decision ultimately to close a border. Obviously, the numbers of people travelling into New Zealand had rapidly declined already, and I imagine would continue to do so. This has expedited that.
So will the government need to put in more money than the $12.1 billion package that it's already announced?
That was based on the fact that we would have a significant drop, and in fact, essentially a real decline, almost end in our international tourism. We already had border control started a month ago in New Zealand. It started with China, a considerable market, and then South Korea. When we saw that, flights ended. So we knew that requiring people to self-isolate would stop travel.
What conversations have Cabinet Ministers had in regards to any potential lockdown within New Zealand?
Ultimately, in cases where that has been used overseas, it's been used where there has been en masse community outbreak. And as you've already heard me discuss, what I'd like New Zealanders to move towards, to model, is a country that is able to manage slow, small outbreaks, slow and small. That wave that has been modelled in other countries, that is what New Zealand ideally would be able to model rather than the tsunami. And so in those cases, those tools are being used in an isolated fashion.
Do you hold any concerns about the freight of any essential medicines?
No, when we made the initial decision on Saturday, we already determined the impact on potentially pharmaceuticals that were coming in via what is otherwise passenger plane, and committed as ministers that we would ensure the retention of that service. So that's something we're working with airlines on.
How confident are you?
What will be?
I'll make this the last couple of questions.
What will be the fate of the migrant workers, many of whom stand to lose their jobs and therefore will be in breach of their visas?
For those who are already here, or for those, you're talking about those who are already here?
Those who are already here, yeah.
There will be some who may be considered essential workers, and the Minister of Immigration is working on that. I'll make that a last question right at the back.
How confident are you that Kiwis coming into the country are going to self-isolate? Isn't that still quite a big risk we're taking?
New Zealanders have to be able to come home, but the message I send very clearly to them is that I know you'll want to look after those around you. Even if you're cavalier about your own health, this is not about you. It is about others. So that self-isolation is, the majority of New Zealanders, I absolutely believe, will do the right thing, but we won't take chances. We will take your names and your details. We will contact you. And we'll do spot checks. But I encourage you to just do the right thing, and I know New Zealanders are united against COVID-19, and that together we will get through this.
Just on
Thank you.
Seasonal workers.
Good evening. Cabinet met this afternoon to assess the rapidly evolving situation relating to COVID-19 and made further decisions to protect New Zealanders from the virus. While there remains no evidence of community outbreak in New Zealand to date, there continues to be significant outbreaks in other countries, and that poses